Let's preface this episode with some famed real-life exemplars of what we will discuss today in this episode titled The Agent of Your Own Life. High school dropout Walt Disney got fired from a Missouri newspaper for not being creative enough. Albert Einstein got kicked out of school and could not speak fluently until age 9. The manufacturer of Ray-Ban sunglasses grew up in an orphanage. Entertainer, business mogul, and philanthropist Dolly Parton was one of 12 kids growing up in severe Appalachian poverty with a father who could not read but worked hard every day in construction. Basketball all-star giant Charles Barkley only weighed 6 pounds at birth and required a total blood transfusion at 6 weeks and was raised by a single mother. What does all of this have to do with you and the workplace? Let's get started. Welcome back to Brain Chatter, where we listen past the daily noise and explore topics at the intersection of leadership, workplace culture, profit, and sustainability. I'm your host, Derek Brown. In this episode, The Agent of Your Own Life, we have a very far-reaching topic that impacts every person and every organization. I am confident you'll find value in listening for the next 30 minutes. Here to share a discussion with us is Dr. Ken Chapman. Dr. Chapman, welcome back for your second episode on Brain Chatter.
Thanks, Derek. It's good to be back. I appreciate the invitation.
Well, of course. Dr. Chapman, could you start off by offering a definition for the concept of being the agent of your own life?
Yes, it's a great place to begin. Being the agent of your own life comes from the behavioral science concept of being agentic, agentic. And agentic means that you not only want to be responsible for yourself, you insist on being responsible for yourself. You don't want anyone else taking responsibility for you. You want to earn your place as an adult among adults, which means, in terms of daily behavior, that you go through your day with this conviction: I can do things today, make choices, engage in behaviors that will make my life better tomorrow. I am not a victim of other people's choices.
When we look across the wide spectrum of human history and modern life in news, movies, books, case studies, stories, nonfiction, and fiction, humans love stories of the hard worker, the overcomer, the survivor, the person who beats the odds and works to achieve success. In your book, The Leader's Code, you've written about the so-called man with 1,000 faces and being the hero of your own story. Would you discuss how these two concepts are intertwined with this concept of being the agent of your own life that you've just defined?
Yes, certainly. It's a very good connection, Derek. The hero with 1,000 faces is from Joseph Campbell and his idea that in every culture there are stories like the one that Derek just described, and that being the agent of your own life and the hero of your own story simply means that you want to be the person who makes the choices that take you to the place you want to be in your life, which means that you're a person as the agent of your own life who, when faced with a challenge, a disappointment, or a failure, you simply ask yourself, what do I need to learn from this? And you take those learnings, integrate it into your understanding and behavior, and move forward. You never come back from a bad experience without having learned something. And therefore, you become the hero of your own story.
Absolutely. The concept of grit has been widely discussed in the past few years by different authors, and there's some famous TED Talks about it. Where does grit fit into this concept?
Well, it's central to it, and I appreciate your asking about it because it is much discussed. And it reminds me of something that my maternal grandmother used to say, and that is that if you think you can, you probably can. If you think you can't, you probably can't. As a boy, I thought this was just the kind of thing that grandmothers said to their grandsons. But it turns out when I got to graduate school, it's central to the concept of being the agent of your own life. If you believe and are determined to do what others can do, you're very likely to be able to do what others can do. But if you decide that for whatever reason you cannot, you almost certainly will not. And this goes to something more central about the human experience, and that is that people can change and grow. The biggest barrier is usually whether or not they decide to change and grow.
Makes a lot of sense to me. Okay, so now with that said, it seems like there are plenty of people who, contrary to the opportunity provided every day to be the agent of their own life, instead follow the lead of certain attention grabbing celebrities, which is to say, they squander time playing a victim. So instead of fighting to be the author of their own fates, some celebrities have made big business out of playing this part. But for a non celebrity, a person taking this road loses in tremendous ways by embracing a static, never ending state of victimhood. Would you discuss how this ongoing victimhood mindset can impact a person's self image, happiness, and even their opportunities in life?
Well, it's a very pointed and relevant question. It takes us to the core of this issue in some important ways. Let's begin with the understanding that almost everybody at one moment or period or time in their life has been victimized by a circumstance or by a person or perhaps even an institution. But what makes the agent of your own life different is that that person who's the agent of their own life believes that they alone decide their attitude and that they alone are responsible for the degree to which they are happy. You see, if I assume the mantle of victimhood, I'm giving other people charge of whether or not I am happy and letting other people decide what my attitude will be. And naturally, I will become resentful toward those people while never accepting that I'm the one who gave them that power, gave them that influence. It's kind of like what you hear young people say today when someone obsesses about how they a girlfriend or boyfriend they broke up with, that he or she is letting that person live rent free in their head. Well, that's just another way of talking about the idea that if I obsess about what other people did or did not do, I'm giving them charge of my life. But if instead I learn what I can and focus on taking charge of my life and choosing my attitude and choosing to do the things that will provide me with the happiness I seek.
Well, that ties in very well, I think, with a recent Wall Street Journal piece that I'm sure some of the listeners, maybe many of the listeners, read. And it's by Jonathan Haidt, and it was titled "The National Crisis of Gen Z." This article came out on December 30th of 2022. And he talks about, in this case, when people have that static victimhood, and he's specifically talking about Gen Zs, the depression rates are driven up significantly. You have these Gen Zs who are on these visual platforms such as Instagram and TikTok in particular, and that it's very much about showing that you have the perfect life. And it becomes this back and forth competition with trying to display that. And as a result, he says that Gen Z females reported in 2020 that 25% of them had major depression, and the comparable number for boys was just under 9%. The comparable number for millennials at the same age registered at half the Gen Z rate, about 13% for girls and 5% for boys. And there's a lot more detail to this. He's also the author of a book that's titled The Coddling of the American Mind: How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting a Generation Up for Failure. The road to victimhood seems to be a fast road that has increasing traffic toward major depression. How can people in the workplace help one another, or how can even people in their families help one another avoid being on this path to major depression that seems to be increasing?
your statistics match everything that I see out there in the real world. So let's talk about that for just a moment. Certainly, it appears to be far more common with late millennials and Gen Zs, but I would argue that I've seen this dynamic in every generation, including my own, the boomers. It typically develops in a person who, during their developmental years, is not expected to develop what's called emotional capacity. Emotional capacity is learning how to deal with failure, disappointment, and frustration, and channel that failure, disappointment, and frustration into more positive energy. If you're rescued from every failure and you're told that every disappointment is not your fault, then you never develop this emotional resistance. That is, your tank full of emotional capacity never fills. So you reach adulthood, and it's very appealing to conclude that you're a victim of other people's choices. And of course, in a sense, you are, in that you were never expected to be responsible for yourself. Of course, it also belies the fact that no matter where I came from or what my experience in my family of origin, I can still choose in adulthood to be the agent of my own life. I like the definition for depression that I was taught in clinical training, and it's this: depression is anger turned inward. For reasons I can't always explain, I'm mad at myself because I'm not doing something different, but I'm not quite sure what to do because I've always had someone rescue me from bad decisions, frustrations, and disappointment. Whether I know it or not, I never developed emotional capacity. I've remained as fragile as I was at 4 years of age. Now, how that applies to the workplace, the most important thing that my supervisor or manager can do is to treat me with basic human dignity and respect, and to insist that I be responsible for myself, that I be responsible for my work product, be responsible for showing up for work, being responsible for getting along with the people I work with, be responsible for safe outcomes.
That's a lot of great information. Thank you. You've worked as a management consultant and industrial psychologist for over 40 years since you founded Ken Chapman and Associates Incorporated. You've seen firsthand a lot of examples of everyday people in all walks of life who have beat the odds and created lives that really have substantial positive impact on everything around them. So from all of your observations, what is the one most important factor in someone who is the agent of their own life and makes their days, weeks, months, and years really count to the max?
Well, I go back to where we began. It's that person who assumes full responsibility for themselves. They may be disappointed with the behaviors of others or frustrated by what others do or don't do, and may occasionally experience failure because of a decision that they themselves made. But the thing that makes them the agent of their own life is that they are relentless in maintaining full responsibility for themselves. They simply will not accept the idea that they are a victim. And then there's a second thing that I'll mention, if you would allow me to, Derek, and that is that I've noticed that the people who are the agents of their own life tend to live for something larger than themselves. It may be a principle, it may be someone they love or care about, it may be an organization that they're a part of, it may be a family, but they have a purpose that's bigger than their own self-interest. And because of that, they are determined to do what they can do each day to make their life better tomorrow, as well as the life of that thing or principle that they love.
What impact does it have on an organization's sustainability when it's populated overwhelmingly by those who are agents of their own lives versus those who are not?
Well, the first one is the place we all want to work. It's full of people who are not victims; they are victors. They see themselves as folks who can do things. For example, on the most practical level, they see themselves as people who can get themselves to work on time and do every day. They see themselves as people who can do good work and therefore have pride of workmanship. And they see themselves as people who build meaningful connections with the people that they work with. They develop pride of association. They are people who create a workplace that makes an 8-hour day feel like 4. Now, the other side, the folks who are victims, and when a workplace is populated with victims, an 8-hour workday typically feels like 20 hours because everybody is posturing to see who is more of a victim than the other. And it becomes rather exhausting.
Yes. And I think all of us have experienced that at some level or another at some point in our lives.
Yes, because when you're dealing with someone who believes that everything that's wrong in the world is somebody else's fault, it's only a matter of time until they're looking at us deciding it's our fault.
Yes. Just like gossip. If people are doing it to you, they're probably doing it about you.
Exactly. Very predictive.
Dr. Chapman, you are no stranger to this podcast. As some listeners will already know, you founded Ken Chapman and Associates Incorporated, which is the sponsor of this podcast and my employer, and came up with the name of this podcast, Brain Chatter, in 2020. The name, as we said, implies listening through the daily brain chatter we all have to filter in order to focus minute by minute and hourly for what matters most. How does filtering through the daily brain chatter impact being an effective agent of your own life?
I love this question, Derek, because it's such an essential feature of being a good supervisor or manager or executive. In a workplace, there's what I call the background noise. And when I use the phrase background noise, I'm not using that phrase to diminish background noise. I'm simply using it as descriptive. And this is what the background noise is. People are always talking, and what their favorite topic is other people. And if you don't provide them with enough information that is accurate, just like the rest of nature, it hates a vacuum. People begin to fill it. Well, any good leader is going to know what's in the background noise so that they will be able to identify when something of value emerges from the background noise. But the good leader will never be defined, directed, or captured by the background noise. He or she will continue to make reality-based decisions, but it's always helpful to know what it is that people are saying, what their feelings, impressions are of the person they report to, as well as the organization that they work for. But that background noise, every now and then, if you're tuned in, will give you a heads up to something that's very important that you need to know. And it enables you to be proactive, the agent of your own life, as opposed to reactive when you find out about it after the fact.
Very insightful. U.S. President Calvin Coolidge was famous for being a person of few but well-chosen words, often delivered with wit and humor. One evening, Silent Cal, as he was famously known, had a characteristic exchange with a Washington, D.C. socialite. She said, "You must talk to me, Mr. President. I made a bet today that I could get more than 2 words out of you." President Coolidge replied, "You lose." How important is a sense of humor for someone who wants to be an effective agent of their own life?
Well, it's indispensable. I love the story about President Coolidge. Having a sense of humor is indispensable because the sense of humor gets you in touch with your own fallibility, the fact that you're not perfect, that you'll make mistakes, and that your own life, your own decisions can be a great source of learning. This works, this doesn't work. And if you have a sense of humor about it, you're able to learn what you need to learn and let yourself move on. But a sense of humor does something else. It promotes a sense of humility, and it allows us to avoid the arrogance and perfectionism that makes it so difficult to maintain a good attitude, to seek happiness, and to have a positive impact on the people around us.
For someone who wants to self evaluate and decide if, in fact, they are doing everything they can themselves to be an effective agent of their own life, what would be your advice on effective self evaluation of this point?
Well, this is an easy one because it's been such a central part of my own journey in learning to be a better agent of my own life, starting when I was very young. The first thing I would say is that you have to ask yourself, how good are you at leveraging your disappointment, your pain, and your failure? And by how good are you at leveraging that, are you working at getting good at learning what you can learn from the bad experiences of life and using them to make tomorrow better? Or if you're getting lost in the bad experiences of life or work, then of course you're edging, moving, maybe running toward victimhood. So it's whether or not you come back from a bad experience with something learned or you come back bitter. It's your decision. And the second thing I would say is this: the important thing when it comes to self evaluating is to be willing to get outside of yourself. And that can be captured in a fairly simple question: how well do you listen to the right people? Now, when I say how well do you listen to the right people, this is what I mean. How well do you listen to the advice of people that you know you trust and respect because they've earned your trust and respect? How well do you listen to people who you know for certain love and respect you and have your best interest in mind? Almost everyone has a family member or a professional colleague or a friend who they know has their best interest in mind. And listening to that person and factoring in their opinions is a big part of making the kind of decisions that allow you to self evaluate and become the agent of your own life. Because the truth is that sometimes our greatest insights come from the sound of our own voice bouncing off the ear of someone we trust.
Very sage counsel. Let's talk about someone who is an organizational leader. It doesn't matter, company, small to large, government agency, nonprofit, doesn't matter. Some sort of organization, and there's someone in that organization. Maybe it's someone who reports to them, maybe it's a peer, maybe it's even their boss. But they realize that this person is on a perennial victimhood mindset path, and they would really like to help that person move over to become an agent of their own life. They realize the benefit that this person they care about would have from making that transition. So, where does this person, this leader who's well intentioned, start in trying to facilitate or encourage this level of transformation in another person? Or is it even any of their business to attempt to do something?
No, I think that it is their business, particularly if it's your direct report or a peer or a friend or a family member that you truly have goodwill for that person. And let's begin by recognizing that when you begin to do something like this, to try to move the person away from victimhood, that it's a lot like trying to save a drowning man. And here I'll inject what every lifeguard knows, and that is that when you swim out to try to save someone who's drowning and they're panicked, you have to approach them very carefully. and it's not unusual for them to resist or fight you all the way back to shore. But when they get back to shore, they're going to thank you again and again. Well, trying to move someone from victimhood to being the agent of their own life is kind of like that. So there are two very simple strategies. One, treat them with dignity and respect. Speak to them as one adult speaking to another adult. And two, insist that they be responsible for what they think, say, and do. And don't allow them to make other people responsible. They won't like it. They'll struggle with it to begin with. But if you are patient and persistent, they'll see where you're going and they'll begin to come along. And when they get there, they'll thank you, just like the drowning man thanked the lifeguard when he brought him back to shore.
What else have I not asked you so far about this topic of being the agent of your own life that is important to mention?
Well, this has been a very enjoyable conversation for me, Derek. You've asked some excellent questions, which have allowed me to share some of the things that are important in my understanding of being agentic or the agent of your own life. I think the only thing I would add would be this, just very briefly, and that's the importance of perspective. And when I say perspective, we as human beings have a tendency to see the moment as the most important thing in our lives, more by default than by design, but we tend to see the present bigger than it is. But maintaining perspective or learning to have perspective means that I recognize that life is not a single event. No matter how great or unpleasant it may be, that life is a series of events, and that I can recover from a bad decision, and that even something spectacular that happens to me may not repeat itself tomorrow. But the constant can be that I am always working today to make choices that will make my life and the life of those around me better tomorrow. I'm not a victim of other people's choices.
Great summary of all of that. Thank you very much. And before we close out this episode, I'd like to mention that since our last podcast interview, Dr. Chapman, a new book has been released, Safety Beyond the Numbers, which is co-authored by you and Tony Orlowski. We did a podcast interview about the book with co-author Tony in episode 18, if someone wants to go back and hear a whole episode about the topics in the book. Would you mind giving a quick overview of this book and what makes it different from your other 5 books, including the one that so far is the most renowned, which is The Leader's Code? And could you also profile who may be interested in Safety Beyond the Numbers?
Certainly, Derek. Thank you for the opportunity to say something about Safety Beyond the Numbers. The book simply addresses an issue that every well-intentioned leader is faced with, and that is putting a lot of time and effort into building an outstanding compliance program, putting in place excellent safe work practices, and doing everything you can to not just meet OSHA standards, but to exceed industry reference points, doing everything you can to create a safe workplace, and then discovering that people are still getting hurt. The book simply recognizes that you got to have a great compliance program. You got to use the best technology that you can. You got to teach safe work practices. But once the company has done everything the company can do and is vigilant about finding new things to do, once the company's done everything it can do to create a safe work environment, people are still going to get hurt unless you find a partner. And that partner is the employee. 9 out of 10 incidents occur when a member of management is not around. So it is the employee who must make safe choices. They must take everything the company's provided, everything the company is taught, and make good decisions about their own safety. That's the core, the crux of the book. And those who would be interested, anyone who's not satisfied with meeting OSHA standards, anyone who's not satisfied with the idea that while we've done a lot, people are still getting hurt. The book is for that executive, that manager, that supervisor who is totally committed to one idea. And the idea is this: no one should get hurt in my workplace, and ownership will give me what compliance alone cannot.
It sounds like ownership has a very strong connection to being the agent of your own life.
You're absolutely right, but maybe that's for another podcast, Derek.
Well, I do hope that we will have another podcast episode together soon. If anyone is interested in learning more about safety beyond the numbers, they can go to the web address safepath.solutions. And if anyone listening is interested in seeing a weekly leadership quote from Dr. Chapman, they can follow Ken Chapman and Associates, Inc. on LinkedIn or Facebook, as well as they have the option to follow the handle The Leaders Code on Instagram or Twitter. For the convenience of those listening, we will post links to various resources that we discuss throughout this episode in the show notes at brainchatterpodcast.com. Thank you so much for your always valuable time and insights on this podcast, Dr. Chapman.
Thank you, Derek. Appreciate the invitation.
Absolutely. Brain Chatter is a production of Ken Chapman and Associates Incorporated. We assist clients across North America and beyond with leadership development, corporate culture transformation initiatives, behavior-based professional development for health and safety issues, individual and team assessments, conflict and performance management, succession planning, and team building, making a difference in organizations and individuals' lives for over 40 years. Learn more at leaderscode.com. And please consider ranking and reviewing us wherever you listen to this podcast, because that helps us reach new additional listeners more than anything else. Thank you for your time.